This is not an easy topic to listen to read, and to talk about.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
But it is a necessary topic to discuss in our families, our circle of friends, and in the faith community.
What does religion and faith become for survivors of sexual abuse? A groundbreaking new book addresses these difficult issues in a wise and deeply personal way. Written by two women theologians who are also abuse survivors themselves, the book is titled Surviving God, a new vision of God through the eyes of sexual abuse survivors. And the authors will be with us on The State of Belief this week.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening.
As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/podcast. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with Jamar Tisby, Tim Alberta, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, Najiba Saeed, and Rob Reiner and Dan Partland talking about their documentary, God and Country. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and to tell people you're close to about all that you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guests. Dr. Grace Ji-sun Kim is professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana, an ordained Presbyterian minister as well. She's the author or editor of more than 20 books, including Hope in Disarray, Piecing Our Lives Together in Faith, and Healing Our Broken Humanity, Practices for Revitalizing the Church and Renewing the World. Dr. Susan M. Shaw is professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. Her books include Reflective Faith, a theological toolbook for women, and God Speaks to Us Too, Southern Baptist Women on Church, Home, and Society. An ordained Baptist minister, Susan makes her congregational home in the United Church of Christ. Grace, Susan, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's so exciting to be with you here on State of Belief, and just thrilled to be on your show. So thank you so much for having us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Susan and Grace, so much. I have been fans of both of yours for, I think it must be decades now, although we're too young for us to have known each other that long. But I just think you all are just such wonderful ministers as well as theologians and people who come with an authenticity that we just need. We need it in America. We need it in the world. And we're going to talk about your book, which I found incredibly moving and so important, and offering a framework for something that we just prefer not to talk about, or we actively suppress it. And so I just want to start by saying thank you for this book. Again, it's called Surviving God, a New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. And before we go on, I wanted to ask your advice on ways that we can invite our listeners into this conversation that will be helpful and healing, rather than by accident or in some ways like being part of a traumatic experience. What are ways that you can help me and teach me to have a conversation about this subject matter that is actually healing, rather than something that might be hurtful for some of our listeners who have their own experiences of this?
Well, Grace and I went into this book as survivors ourselves. And so we would want survivors to know that we are speaking as people who understand what they've gone through and what they continue to go through. And while the book has a lot of difficult material, and we're going to talk about that, we also ended on a note of joy. And so we want survivors also to know that we're going to get to the joy as we talk about it. And as you listen to Grace and me talk, even about the hard stuff, I think that sense of surviving and thriving and finding joy is always a part of our conversations.
Yeah. And to add to that, this is a very difficult topic. It was hard to write, and, we've done other podcasts and interviews so far, and every time I do it, it's not that easy, even if the questions may be similar. So for listeners, just to know that this is not an easy topic to listen to read, and to talk about, but it is a necessary topic to discuss in our families, our circle of friends, and in the faith community. So even though it's really difficult, I think having an openness, to want to listen, to interact, an open mind, for the survivors and for those around survivors, and even those who have perpetuated violence, we're hoping that they will also read and listen so they can be changed themselves. Because the expectation is always that the survivors need to change, but it's really not us, it's the other people. So, Paul, it's a hard topic, and I'm just so glad that you're willing to share this moment with us, to share our book and our research and our experience. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And part of the genesis of this book and others was, there was the big Me Too moment, and then that was quickly followed by a Church Too moment. And I think it's really important that you both really lean into the fact that abuse has happened in the church, and it's not some small thing or accidental thing or incidental thing, but it's actually connected to broad questions of how church functions and how church is experienced by people, especially people who are in more vulnerable positions. And so how important was it for you to really not write a general book about this, but really lean into the experience of women, but also others who have experienced marginalization and violence in the church, to really focus on the church as people who have in some ways lived in that experience and in that community?
Grace, you want to start off on this one?
Yeah, sure. Um, that's an important question. I think people think that it really doesn't happen in the church. So that's always a problem. So we really wanted to emphasize that it happens just as much in the church as in the wider society. And then in certain ways, the church either perpetuates it because of our own doctrines, our own views of who God is, and patriarchy is so embedded in Christianity itself and in other religions that it almost kind of allows it. It's okay that it's happening, and we sweep it under the rug if this happens to a church member. So there's a lot of dynamics that's so strange in the church. It happens in society, but there's a weird dynamic that happens in the church because the church, the theology, the patriarchy, our male images of God just somehow allow this and sometimes make it seem like it's okay that it's happening because we have allowed so many youth pastors let go freely from their own um, violent act towards their own church members and their youth group. We've allowed other ministers and leaders to get away with this. So it's really important that this discussion is happening in the wider society, but also in the church. Of course, there's a few books out there already, but we really wanted to dig deeply as feminist theologians. This our second book together. Some people can barely finish one book together, but Susan and I were able to finish a second book together. And our first book really kind of introduces us into how we can think about this intersectionally and solve it intersectionally. So that's why it was really crucial as feminist theologians, as feminist scholars, and as practitioners, as ordained ministers to talk about it and
Yeah.
to bring our own experiences, our own context, our own cultural differences, and really bring it to the forefront because some ethnicities and cultures just can't talk about it or refuse to talk about it and refuse to acknowledge that it's happening in their churches.
Yeah.
So this is a
Yeah.
really deep problem. There's multidimensional parts of this problem. We cannot address everything in the book, but we try to address a lot of these issues.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting, the chapter on God and the language we use for God and the attributes of God and putting those together with why that brings the church into such a potential for this because God is understood and constantly preached in a certain way. And so, Susan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. You have a really important chapter on God that really opened up for me as someone who's been around a lot of theology, and it helped me expand some of the reasons why I've been so uncomfortable with male language with God, that this exclusive male king, da 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 da. But you really brought it into a new level for me. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the traditional language we have to talk about God is Father, King, Lord, Master, that God is omnipotent and omniscient. And that language and that understanding of God is really problematic because it grows out of patriarchy. And so these are the characteristics we associate with men, and having a God like that then essentially reinforces and justifies men having exclusive power over women, children, feminized men, and marginalized other people. And so we really wanted to explore the ways that those images, that language, and those beliefs have created a framework that enables abuse in the church and then at the same time minimizes then what happens to survivors because they're merely women or children. They're less important. They're supposed to be under the authority of a man the way that men are supposed to be under the authority of God, who just happens to look a lot like them. And so we thought that was important to explore because, one of the big questions is, what kind of God are we really suggesting there is when we say that God is all powerful? Because that means God either caused, willed, or allowed abuse. And that's not really a God I would want much to do with, nor is it the God I've experienced. And so we
Mm.
really wanted to dig into that.
What I think it's important for our listeners to hear is that there is this really important critique of theology and structures, but also really a beautiful imagination of other ways of understanding God and Jesus, and we're going to get to that. But I do want to I want to talk a little bit more about some of the symptoms of the problem, and just in society. I'm not going to obviously not speak for anybody else, but it is shocking to see the way I can single out the Southern Baptists, but it's not just them, but how they kind of circled the wagons and really tried to minimize this. And, they were in some ways forced to do some things, and it seemed like there was progress, but it always seems like it's, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I don't know, because there was this idea, maybe there's going to be a reckoning. And I guess Grace, I'm wondering, how have you been viewing within the church the reckoning with sexual abuse that has taken place?
There hasn't been much reckoning. I think cross denominations, we have a hard time. I think When I look at the history of the church, a lot of its decisions are made not like, oh, some inspirational divine thing that occurred, but a lot of it has to do with finances, with the, celibacy of priests. That had to do with finances and economics. Other decisions are made that way. And when we think about sexual abuse happening, the church doesn't want to deal with it because it's going to cost them a lot of money. So finances also determine this issue. And we just want to make ourselves look good. Like, oh yeah, it happens in society. It happens in the workplace. It happens in the schools. But of course, we're Christians, so it can't happen in our churches. So we're in a state of denial. We
Mm,
don't we cannot imagine a pastor doing this, or a youth pastor, or a youth leader, or an elder. Like it just doesn't make sense because we're supposed to be holy. And I think that's all tied into patriarchy. Of course, women abuse, but the majority of the abuses are still men who are causing this abuse. So tied that in with patriarchy and your previous question about, this maleness of God, it allows this thing to happen. And, as I think more theologically every day, I'm thinking that our image, our metaphors, our understanding, our language, our words about God actually really, really has a deep impact on our actions, our thinking, our modes of behavior. I never thought that way like 20 years ago when I was, a young theologian. I never thought of the big impact, but it really does. This maleness, all the metaphors that Susan just mentioned, if we continue to use those language in the church, it really allows abuse, allows domination, allows colonialism, allows subjugation, allows genocide. All these things, they are intersecting forms and acts of violence perpetuated against other people. Our book doesn't expand to all those forms of violence, it just looks at sexual violence. But our perspective, our language about God really, really has a deep impact. I think
mm,
that's how colonialism was able to get away with all these hundreds of years of the damage, genocide to slave enslavement. All of these are,
yeah.
you know, institutionalized or systemic forms of violence. So, I think we really have to unpack who God is and then start from there. And I'm glad that our book had this deep kind of chapters on who God is and what
Yeah.
we do with it. And we don't want to keep talking about it. We want people to read the book too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But I think one of the other interesting aspects of the book is that you really talk about sexual violence or violence in the Bible. And you mention several stories where this happened. And I think it's helpful to name those for what they were rather than kind of, oh, that's just the Bible. What were some of those stories and what were some of the lessons that we might learn from those?
Well, I mean, we start off with Eve, and that might surprise people because they may not think of Eve as a survivor of sexual violence, and yet what we see is right away Eve is shamed sexually in the Garden of Eden, and then the church sort of picks up on that and then reframes Eve as some sort of temptress who seduced Adam into eating the fruit. And of course, we can go back into tradition, and we know of Lilith, who would not be subjugated to Adam. And that's why, Lilith had to be tossed away and Eve brought in to be more subjugated. And that's what the story does. And we see in modern society how a lot of churches then use that story to say that all women are now subjugated because, Eve caused Adam to eat the fruit and brought sin into the world. And and yet, if we overlook the sort of sexual shaming that happens in that, we miss, I think, a key root for the sexual shaming that happens now to women. That's part of the setup for abuse and our inability to talk about it. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn in this is the church has got to stop shaming women. It's got to stop being shameful about sexuality, controlling sexuality, and it's got to stop subjugating people because those things lead to the sort of chaos we see in places like the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, those were my people for a long time. And that was my theology growing up. And I know what that can do to someone.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, I think is just really important is that you talk about the question of like, what does forgiveness look like? And what is submission? These things that are often used in like, we're forgiven because Jesus did this thing, I'm quoting, and therefore we have to forgive. It just seems like such a setup for damage, like further damage upon damage. Grace, I mean, I think that was just a really important to name what like mandatory forgiveness can look like in the church and what it can do to young people or people of any age who are forced to forgive their assailant. And there's no, without any sort of resolution, but just like that is the resolution. You're going to forgive and then we're going to go on and, done.
Yeah. So, I think that the church is so quick to preach about forgiveness. Well, it is scriptural, but we forget that it's this multidimensional, and we continue to preach about cheap grace, that you don't need to do anything. Oh, you're forgiven and you're just let go. But we want a forgiveness that really asks those who have caused violence to do something. They need to change. They need to, the church often shames the victims, which I don't understand why it's happening, but it happens across denomination and ethnicities. We tend to shame as if they were the temptress, as Susan was talking about Eve, and those symbols, those kind of narratives we interpret in scripture throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Like Mary Magdalene somehow looks like some prostitute, and we've kind of changed stories around, and we've done that to many women in the Bible. So we continue to do that in the church. So we tend to blame the victim, and then the perpetrators are let go free. Oh, they're forgiven. And then we forget about it. But if we're going to break this cycle of violence, the perpetrator needs to change, needs to do more, because this forgiveness is not, we cannot treat it as this cheap grace that Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about. It really kind of requires us to act and change and take responsibility for what has happened. If people don't take responsibility, then it's going to continue to happen from generation to generation. And going back to your previous question about the Bible, I think, Susan mentioned about Eve, but we have so many other stories of sexual violence committed towards women. And, in one way, we have to recognize that these were told and written from male perspective. So we are not getting the victim's perspective. So everything is from the dominant patriarchal perspective. The writers were men. So we really need to dig deep, read it intersectionally, read it from different hermeneutics to understand what is happening to these women. When we think about Bathsheba and Hagar and all these, one after another, even Mary, mother of Jesus, we really need to reread these stories and understand that violence have been committed towards many of these biblical characters. And we know many women were not even included in the scriptural passages. So we know that this has been ongoing. It's a huge problem, and the church really needs to deal with it and tackle it from the pulpit and in the Sunday school rooms, adult forums, etc.
Up next, more with Reverend Grace Kim and Reverend Susan Shaw. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe to the Next Generation podcast at stateofbelief.com/podcast. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
Hey there, curious minds.
Get ready to embark on a unique journey at the crossroads of money and religion with our new podcast, Money Meet Meaning.
The seductive effect of money, we think it can do the work that God does because there's something about money that does that. It's wild.
I'm Amber Hacker.
And I'm Tom Levinson.
Tune in for a blend of wisdom and levity as we decode the path to a more meaningful relationship with money.
I think giving, and this is a little crass, but I feel like it's the ultimate middle finger to money. It's liberating to give some away.
This podcast is your gateway to a vibrant and thought-provoking exploration of the interconnectedness of wealth and spirituality.
Join us as we unravel the surprising influence of ancient wisdom on modern finances.
Faith pervades people's lives and our society. And because money is such an important part of people's lives, exploring that intersection of faith and money, I think, is super, super interesting.
Get ready to be informed, entertained, and inspired to transform your financial outlook with Money Meet Meaning. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guests are Dr. Susan M. Shaw and Dr. Grace G. Sun Kim, authors of the new book, Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. There's a term that I had not heard before, but I really like it, and it's indecent stories. You introduced this idea of indecent stories, and can you unpack what those are and why we should maybe be telling more indecent stories? You just mentioned from the pulpit and in our education opportunities. What's an indecent story as you understand it in the context of this book?
Well, the stories that have happened towards women, the violence, particularly the sexual violence, but there's also different forms of violence that have been committed against women. The church for the last 2,000 years have been male dominated. Popes, bishops, priests, ministers, theologians, church leaders, these were all men. And when we're thinking about, I preach most Sundays. When we're thinking about the church liturgy, the lectionary, until recently, women were not part of this. So these stories, indecent stories, they weren't included in the pulpit. And so men didn't talk about sexual violence that happens to women. Because they didn't need to. They were the ones that were perpetuating it. So this discourse is largely absent in the 2,000 years of our church history. It being absent does not mean it never happened. It's always been happening. When we think about, war that occurs in different parts of the world, we know sexual violence has always been part of war, because sexual violence, rape, is nothing to do about, having a good time. It's all tied in with violence. So we have to remember that when we think about genocide, when we think about enslavement and colonialism, they all had sexual violence. When I think about my own context with Korean, we went through the Korean War. We also went under colonialism under Japan. Under Japanese colonialism, hundreds and thousands of young women and young girls were kidnapped. They were taken either under the pretense that they're going to work in factories or given jobs. They were made into comfort women. So during the war, they were sent all over in different parts of Asia. They were stationed as sexual workers. And it's not the typical sexual worker that Western people may have in mind. They were locked up into tiny little rooms, and they were raped anywhere from 50 to 80 times a day. And so many of these young women died. And those who were caught disease, they were, taken out naked, and many of them were shot to death. So we include some of these stories, and sorry about the trigger warning, but this is part of our history. And of course, religion is tied into it, church is tied into it, because church, in many cases, allowed it to happen. They were silent. So in many cases, what we're trying to do is try to break the silence. We want churches to use our books in their study groups. I know so many churches have adult forum. They have Bible study groups, and many of them are using nice rosy books, and that's fine. But sometimes they have to tackle these hard topics of sexual violence because it is present in our churches, and it needs to be tackled in the pulpit. It's hard for me to preach about sexual violence in the pulpit too, because I find in many churches they're not ready to hear it. But I think we slowly need to talk about it because it is so prevalent in our society. Young girls who are being violated, they don't have the courage to speak up sometimes. And the church doesn't provide this opportunity or a chance to talk about it and to deal with it, especially if it happens in the church. And we know the Catholic Church is, dealing with it publicly, and they don't want to deal with it because it's costing them so much money, but it needs to be done.
Yeah. I think that one of the ways to think about this work is it's also pastoral, in the sense that many of the people who are in church, far too many, have experienced some sort of sexual violence, and to ignore it is to ignore the responsibility of what it means to pastor your church, because it's a location of pain. And, and what your book offers is that there is something that the church and the faith can offer here. I love the kaleidoscope vision of God, is that God is kaleidoscope, that God is many different ways of being in our lives and in the world. And I thought, there were some really beautiful ways that you all were kind of doing theology that were new to me. God as child was really interesting to me. Maybe, Susan, you can talk a little bit of the kaleidoscope of God and some of the ways that God can be, if we reimagine God can walk with and be and inspire healing in the church.
Yeah, so the notion of a kaleidoscope is something we actually came up with in our first book, Intersectional Theology, because it suggests that there's not one way to see God, but that rather it's ever-changing and multifaceted. And so each of us has some little piece of that kaleidoscope, and those things shift across time. And so that keeps us from thinking we know it all, that we have all the right answers, and then from excluding the experiences of others. And so our theological approach in this book then wasn't to start with church doctrine about God and then theologize down to survivors, but rather we started with the experience of survivors, both Grace and my own experience, but also the people we talked to and people who've written about this. And then we theologize God from that perspective, but we do it in this multifaceted way because we all bring all of these differences, both of gender, race, class, and so on, but also of our experience of sexual violence. And so those experiences then fed into all of these different possibilities for reimagining God. And so the notion of God as child came from Rita Nakashima Barak, who has written about that. For me, there's one that's called The God Who Overcomes, and then it's in parentheses, even trolls. And that grew out of my own experience of writing something that had nothing to do with any of this, but then getting trolled in some really ugly ways, which were very gendered and sexualized. I mean, I got called every ugly name in the book, to the point we were having to make sure that the university had a safety plan for me, all that kind of stuff. And yet in that, I also had more people get in touch with me to check on my safety, to thank me for my work, and so what had been a horrible experience became a wonderful experience. And so for me, the image that came out of that was the idea of the God who could overcome trolls. And so we do that with a lot of the mothering God, or using Monica Coleman's work to come up with God as making a way out of no way. And so it starts in those experiences and then becomes all of these things all at once. And so it's
Mm.
not a matter of picking the one right view of God, but rather letting all of those coexist side by side. Even when they're in contradiction with one another, that's okay too, because we think God can embody all of that.
Mm. I love that. I mean, it's really beautiful. It also, it very much respects the diversity of experience that people have, um, and empowers, and not that people need legitimization, but it says that this is absolutely legitimate. It's as legitimate as any other experience of God in the world, and because it's yours, and it's okay. I mean, I think sometimes we're so like preached down to that we're told this is the realm, these are the parameters of what's acceptable, and what you're offering, I think, to our listeners and all of the people who you interviewed were like, actually, there's lots of ways, and you listed some great theologians who I think are really are so powerful, and so it's I found that really beautiful, and an important kind of contribution to how we opt to do theology, for those of us who opt to do theology. But giving permission for people's own experience to matter is just really, really important. We're about to go into Holy Week, and you also talk a lot about Jesus, and as two pastors might. But Grace, I wonder, like, if you can tell us a little bit about how you imagine Jesus factoring in the story of Jesus and Jesus's words that we're about to really be focusing on for those of us who are Christian, and how you imagine Jesus in this book of awareness, but also healing.
Yeah. So, we included God and we included Jesus. Before I get into Jesus, just to say about, when we're thinking about the divine, we're these finite beings and we're thinking about the infinite. That's why, as you said, Paul, we want people to understand it. God is so vast, we can never, ever come to the fullness of the understanding of who God is. So everyone's experience is important. So your different cultural experience, your sexual experience, your gender experience, your socioeconomic, your ability, all those are so important. And as we're approaching Holy Week and we're thinking about the crucifixion of Christ, I don't think, we present in the book the possibility or the probability of Jesus being violated. I'm sure no churches will probably tackle this topic, especially during Holy Week. Their focus is on the crucifixion and the resurrection. We go in a bit deeper, and the possibility that before the crucifixion, when he was arrested, the possibility of sexual violence committed against Jesus. Why? Because so many prisoners were violated in so many ways. During the Roman Empire, and even today, we know sexual violence happens to prisoners of war. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. They're violated because these acts are about power and getting rid of someone else's power. It has not, that's the bottom line. And so for Jesus, he's arrested because, he was going around and teaching these things that people were upset about. He was proclaiming that he was a son of God. People were so angry that they really wanted to arrest him and do violent acts towards him. None of us are offended when we think about, the lashing and the crown of thorns and the physical violence, but the probability that he was sexually violent, people will be very upset. But if he was, and our book, we tackle this topic, it really, the suffering of Christ, it brings a different dimension to this, because the sexual violence or the physical violence that people experience, particularly women, it's rampant. And our experiences have been ignored in the church. and within theology. Feminist theology only arose in the 1960s. So that's so recent in our history. That's, you know, when I was born around that time. So it's not that long when we think about the last 2,000 years of history. So to really include some of these experiences that mostly women experience, these gender violence that Jesus could have experienced on that night of his arrest before the crucifixion, really brings a different dimension to how God suffers with us, how God is with us in our pain and suffering and understands what we are going through. And that's something that theologians do not want to really tackle with. And, Susan and I don't know if Susan was being courageous. I was being a little courageous dealing with it because I don't know how, Paul, once you write a book, we don't know how people are going to respond. So there's always that little fear in me with this book, but with any book that I put out, if it's not, if it goes against the grain of what people in the pews or what theologians have been talking about for the last 2,000 years.
Well, let me say, that had never occurred to me, but I don't think it's absurd at all. I mean, you raised, we don't really get into that time period when he was a prisoner, and the reality of what happened to prisoners in that time period. I don't think that this is, you're not raising some sort of crazy idea at all. You're just articulating something that is very uncomfortable. But as you raise a good point, like we're fine with the rest of the abuse that he experienced, and we call it redemptive.
Yeah.
I don't call it redemptive, but that's like the theology that is often preached is like all of that pain was for our benefit. And it,
So
I mean, I Susan is like saying, wait a second. I'm not saying that's the way I preach this. I'm saying that is not like,
I know where Susan is.
I'm not out on a limb and saying something that isn't being preached in many churches.
What you're saying is exactly what the majority of the churches are saying. And I'm so thankful when you said, what we're saying is not absurd. But, the churches, we because we're thinking, with the Old Testament and the foreshadowing of Jesus's death, and Jesus understood as a Lamb of God, being slaughtered, so that violent theology, church are very, very comfortable with it. We almost like you want to hear it, on that Good Friday, this violent act, that needed to be done, to redeem us and to give us new life. Yeah. So Susan, anyway, you can go on.
No, well, let me just say, I honestly can't listen to it. And I went to seminary with Dolores Williams, blessed be her memory. And, it's not the way I was brought up. I mean, it's not my theology at all. And so but I do think it's a prevalent theology. And I think it does contribute in some ways to the overall theme of your book, which is a lot of theology has led to some bad practices. And so, we're getting in deep here, but it is really interesting. Susan, go ahead.
No, I grew up with all that, right? I grew up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist. So you can imagine the depth at which we were taught about how, Jesus paid it all and all of that sort of thing. And yet, these same people who want to call God Father, and you think about, okay, what would we think of an earthly father who beat his child to death and then killed his child, for someone else, or demanded that somebody's child had to die in order to make things okay? We would find that absurd. The same thing, I mean, the outrage of Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac. I mean, that God might even ask that, to me, is an outrageous notion about the divine, because it is rooted in our own violence as human beings, particularly patriarchal violence. And so for me, as someone coming out of women and gender studies now, so I've kind of flip-flopped how I do theology, what I would say is the experience came first. So society was patriarchal and male and violent and wanted to justify that. And to justify it, you create a religious system in which you have a God who is male and patriarchal and violent and who demands violence.
Mm,
And that then justifies the ongoing practices and maintains
yeah.
patriarchal violence.
One of the kind of liberative moments in my life, which isn't necessarily going to be for everybody, but just reading Walter Raushenbush and him saying, like, that's not the theology that we need today. This was over 100 years ago. He said, like, in medieval times, they were looking for this kind of theology but what we need is a theology that actually lifts up all people and understands Jesus in a different way. And so we have to create. And so what you're doing here, I just want to what you're doing here is what theologians are supposed to do. So any listeners who are like, what are they talking about? This is what theologians do. This is what pastors do, is they think deeply about our tradition and they imagine what has been and what can be. And I think, I haven't mentioned this on the show yet, but I'm going to now. I just wrote a children's book called Together We Rise. And I pushed together like all this theology. And it was for Easter, because I didn't have any children's book that I can offer my children. I have 2 young children, for like to talk about like what Easter meant, what the Holy Week meant. I was like, I don't have it, so I'm going to write it. And I wrote it down in a Facebook post, and people really like loved it. And so I just got an illustrator to do it, and I just published it. So I will share the book with you. But it really gets into like what you're talking about, like what it meant for Jesus to be on the cross, not as a sacrifice for, but actually as God with. And like understanding, like because it was God experiencing the pain. And also what it meant for resurrection to be a communal affair, not just like, so anyway, Together We Rise. I'm going to talk about it more, but I'm like excited to share it with you, because I do think children don't have a lot of resources to talk about what you guys are talking about. And I do think it's an opportunity. We end every show with a question of like, what gives you hope? We've talked a lot about really difficult things, and I thank you so much for your honesty, your bravery, and your creativity and imagination. And those are, if people don't understand, that's what theology is: creativity, imagination, communal exercise in considering God. But I'd invite both of you to think about, in the context of this book and in the context of what we've been talking about with Jesus and God, or however you want it. You don't have to, if you do it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be about any of that. What gives you hope right now? Grace, I'll start with you. What gives you hope right now?
Well, for me, hope is something that, the Bible's talking about hope, peace, love. It's really being anchored in Christ. And it's not this, optimism. I think many people think hope is optimism. For me, it is this drive and this push to work towards justice. That's what hope is for me. And, you mentioned my book, Hope in Disarray, and that's what I do. It is this movement that pushes me to work for justice. And then this book, I'm so glad that you were talking about creativity, because many people don't know what theologians are doing. And if we get a little too creative, they think we're kind of off, off course. But I think, this book is trying to offer hope. We do end in a good note. We do talk about all this horrible things that happen to people and men and women and children, but we want to end that there is some hope. We have to work for some justice. This gender injustice, this gender violence is prevalent in our society and in our church. So my hope is that the church will deal with it and try to tackle it so that we can lessen this gender violence that happens in the church walls and beyond the church walls.
I'm going to be a little more concrete, because I can think of 2 things right off the bat that give me hope. And one is my students, and the other is NCAA women's basketball. And I'll come to the second one in a minute and explain theologically. My students come to me, and right now I'm teaching mostly intro level, so 18 and 19-year-olds. And they are so far ahead at that point on their thinkings about gender, race, class, sexuality than, say, students 20 years ago. And I know progress is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I see a huge step there. And they come in and they may not know feminism theoretically, but they want to do the right thing. They want to create a better world. And that makes me so hopeful. They're already more environmentally conscious. They're already more activist. And that I get excited. This is why I chose in the last few years of my career to teach 18 and 19-year-olds again instead of graduate students, because I love that. The reason NCAA women's basketball gives me hope is look at where we are. So we're at this moment where, Caitlin Clark is selling out arenas. And prior to that, there's been this whole buildup since Title IX. And so what that's showing me is that structural changes can make a difference. So Title IX was this legislation that nobody who wrote it had an idea it would transform athletics. And yet it did. And within that, you've got now these conversations with like Dawn Staley and with others who are talking about gender and race and sexuality. And because sports is so central in the American psyche on the whole, that's a really important place. And I see that change can happen. It's slow, it's uneven, it's not for everybody. There's a whole other world outside basketball that we need to address. But I think that becomes a moment where we see, maybe we can make some progress. And I have to think about those things because I mostly despair and am kind of cynical about the world. But those two things make me go, okay, maybe I won't see it, but I think we can get there.
Well, you know what? The question of getting there, or the process. But let me just say, you two have helped us take a step along the path of getting there. And I really appreciate it. I recognize and appreciate the courage and that it took, along with the vulnerability. And I just, I hope I can be one of those people who walks alongside you, and slays the trolls if they come. And we've all been doing this for a while, and just know that I really respect and admire both of you. Dr. Grace G. Sun Kim is professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana, and an ordained Presbyterian minister. Dr. Susan M. Shaw is professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University and an ordained Baptist minister who today makes her congregational home in the United Church of Christ. Their new book is titled Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. The publication date is March 26th. Susan, Grace, thank you so much for being with us here on this State of Belief.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, it was a joy and an honor. So thank you so much for reading our book and for having this discussion with us. It was really, really deep and so appropriate. And so I'm so grateful right now.
A new signature program from Interfaith Alliance is the Interfaith Leadership Network. This year, we will be launching an initial cohort of 10 to 15 diverse faith leaders, clergy, non-clergy, but all who are seeking to effect change in their state and local communities across the country. Every member of the ILN will identify one critical issue in their community, guided by their perspective in community leadership, and will receive the accompanying funds, mentorship, and collaborative support they need to carry it out. This is important for all of our listeners. Know that the nomination and application process is open through the end of March. Learn more at interfaithalliance.org/ILN. Please go check it out if you or someone you know might be a good person to join the Interfaith Leadership Network. Look forward to hearing from you. Please be sure to subscribe to Thus State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/podcast. We need your help to keep making the State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram at the handle @StateOfBelief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.